Figma recently announced a bunch of exciting updates, and one of the features that has been updated is auto layout. So in today's video, I'm going to go through all the new auto layout updates, and I'm going to show you the best ways you can apply them to your design. So let's dive in. Here I have a blog post card that has been designed using auto layout features. As you can see, it's responsive, but if I try to shrink it like this, as you can see, these tags are cut off, and that's not ideal. That's because in the past, we didn't have the possibility of wrapping elements, wrapping auto layout objects into a new line. But that's not the case anymore because auto layout has now this feature. So let me show you how it works. Here I need to select this particular auto layout frame, this tags frame. And if you head over to the auto layout section, as you can see now, instead of having two different directions, vertical and horizontal, we have a new option called wrap. So if I set the parent element here, in this case the tags frame, to wrap, you may think that nothing happened. However, look what happens when I select this blog post card and I try to shrink it. Look what happens. There it is. As you can see now, these auto layout objects are wrapping to a new line, which is awesome. But that's not all. I'm going to show you more use cases in a second. So now instead of shrinking this card, let me expand it. I'm going to increase its width. And as you can see, this text grows. This text layer grows. That's because if I select it, you can see that its resizing option is set to fill container. So it takes up the whole available width of its parent element, which is this heading and text. However, as you may know, it's not ideal to have long passages of text. So if you want to have an optimal line length, you can now set minimum and maximum width and minimum and maximum height for your auto layout objects. It's so cool. Let me show you how it's done. Here, let's suppose you want to set a maximum width for this text layer. The only thing you need to do is select it. And if you head over to the design panel here, you can see this drop down menu. I'm going to open it up and it allows us to add a minimum width and a maximum width. So in this case, I'm going to set a maximum width for that. I'm going to click on it and here I'm going to specify the maximum width value. So in this case, let's set it to something like 500. Just like this. And as you can see now, we have a maximum width of 500, which means that this text layer's width cannot grow more than 500 pixels. So now, no matter how big our card gets, this text layer cannot grow more than 500 pixels, just like this. But we didn't set a minimum width for that. You can go ahead and do that as well if you want, and I'm going to show you how to do it in a second. So now I'm going to copy this blog post card and I'm going to paste it in a frame. Just like this, inside this desktop frame. Let me change the background color here for this desktop frame to something a little bit darker. And now I'm going to duplicate this card twice. Let me duplicate it, move it to the right and duplicate it once again. And I'm going to select these three cards and just add auto layout to them. So I'm going to hit Shift and A and put them inside an auto layout frame. And as you can see now, we have all these cards inside this frame one. Let me rename it to cards, which is the parent frame. All right, let me align it to the center. If you have used auto layout before, I'm sure you know that you can specify the spacing between your auto layout objects right here. So I'm gonna set it to 50 now, but you may also know that Figma could automatically decide this spacing for you. And in the past, if you wanted Figma to automatically adjust this gap for you, you needed to go to the advanced settings here. And here there was an option called spacing mode. And there were two options, packed and space between. We needed to set it to space between, and then Figma would automatically adjust the spacing between these cards depending on the main frame's width. But that's not the case anymore. You can now simply open up this drop down menu, and here you can set it to auto, and now Figma automatically adjusts the spacing between your auto layout objects. So if I just go ahead and resize this parent frame, this cards frame, look what happens. As you can see, the gap between them is automatically adjusted. It's not a new feature, however, the way you can apply it to your frames has been changed. All right, we basically covered all the new auto layout features. However, I'm going to show you one more use case which is quite helpful. So here we have this desktop frame, and when we design a project, we usually design the tablet breakpoint and the mobile breakpoint as well. And most of the time we change the layout of our page depending on the screen's width. So on tablet, we may need to change the layout of this page. So instead of having 3 cards in one row, we may have 2 rows of cards. And on mobile devices, we may only have one column. Well, in the past, it wasn't possible to make these kind of changes using Figma's native features. But now, thanks to the auto layout new features, it's possible. Let me show you how. So here, if I select this cards frame and I try to resize it, as you can see, the card's width is intact. That's because if I select the cards inside, you can see that they have a fixed width. So let's change that. I'm going to select all these cards and I'm going to change their resizing option from fixed width to fill container. Now I'm going to select the cards frame, and here I am going to change this horizontal gap between items from auto to something like 32. So now we can maintain a 32 pixel margin in between. And now if I go ahead and resize this parent frame, look what happens. As you can see, these cards shrink and grow depending on the parent's frame size. But how can we change the layout here? Let me show you how. If I select these cards and I set a minimum width for them, we can change the layout automatically. So while they are selected, I'm going to head over to this drop-down menu and I'm going to add a minimum width. I'm going to set it to 300. So these cards' width cannot be smaller than 300 pixels. Now you may say that, alright, it should work, but it doesn't. If I select this cards frame and I try to resize it, the layout doesn't change. Look what happens. As you can see now, as soon as I reach that 300 pixel minimum width that I just set, these cards stop shrinking. However, what I want to achieve is this. Since we don't have much space here, I want to change the layout. I want Figma to wrap these cards to a new line. So how can we do that? Yes, you're right. We can use this new wrap feature. So while this cards frame is selected, I'm going to set the auto layout direction to wrap, just like this. And look what we've got. Now Figma can automatically wrap these cards to a new line. Isn't it interesting? It's so powerful. So if I just go ahead and duplicate this card like this, and I select the parents frame, and I try to resize it, I'll get two cards in the next row, which is awesome. But look what happens when I keep shrinking this parents element. Let me just expand my main frame like this. And if I just keep shrinking this cards frame, look what happens. There we go. Now we have only one column of cards, which is awesome. I'm pretty sure you were waiting for this new feature, and here it is. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about another feature of Figma called constraints. What are constraints? Well, basically constraints tell Figma how you want your elements respond to the changes we make to their parent's dimension. So for example, if you have this frame, which is the parent of this circle, how you want this child to behave when we adjust the size of its parent. Okay, so that's the simplest definition of constraints. It allows us to make our design responsive, and also it allows us to make our design adapt to different screen sizes, because nowadays we don't only design for one particular screen size. There are many different screen sizes in the market. There are many different monitors. There are many different mobile screens. So we need to make sure that our design adapts to all those screen sizes, and constraints help us with that. But you might think that it's similar to auto layout, isn't it? Well, yes, it is to some extent. Auto layout is way more advanced, and in fact, before the introduction of the auto layout feature, constraints were the only things we could use to make our design responsive. However, many limitations came with that, and when Figma introduced the auto layout feature, many of those issues were solved. But we still use constraints to make sure that our design is fully responsive and it adapts to different screen sizes. So let's get into it and let me show you how it works. So here I already prepared a few screens. Let's start with this one. Here I created this circle. It's a 200 by 200 pixel circle, and I placed it inside this frame. Keep in mind that you cannot set constraints for elements that are outside a frame. In order to set constraints for elements, your elements should be placed inside frames, okay? If I put it outside this frame, just like this, and if you take a look at the design panel on the right side, we don't see the constraint section anymore. So this is the first thing you need to know. Just like that, I'm going to place it right here. To show you how it works, I'm going to set its X value here to 100. So the left padding is set to 100, and I'm going to set the Y value to 100 as well. The top padding is 100. So now if you take a look at the constraints section here, you can see we have these two drop down menus, and also here we can adjust the constraints. Basically, we can set horizontal constraints and vertical constraints. And if I zoom in, these dashed lines, these blue dashed lines are our constraints, are the constraints of this particular element. So at the moment, the constraints are set to top and left. What does it mean? It means that if I resize its parent element, which is this desktop frame, the position of this particular element will be maintained relative to the left and the top edge of this frame. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to move this frame to the left, just like this. And now I'm going to resize it. Okay, so I'm going to make it smaller. As you can see, nothing changed. It stayed where it was, right? And we still have a 100 pixel left and a 100 pixel top padding. If I make it larger, the same scenario. Now let me move this circle to the right side, right here, okay? And I'm gonna set its right padding to 100. So let me move it to the left, just like this. So now we have a 100 pixel right and a 100 pixel top padding. And now imagine you want it to stay on the top right corner of this frame. To do that, we cannot just set the constraints to top and left, obviously, because it wouldn't work. Instead, we need to set it to top and right. So here I can head over to the constraints section and I can adjust the constraints to top and right, just like this, and make sure to take a look at these indicators, these dashed lines, because it's going to help you understand how your constraints work. And now if I select this desktop frame and I try to resize it, as you can see, it stays right here and it maintains its top and right padding. Now let's explore other options here. If I open up this drop-down menu, as you can see, we have 5 different options. We have left, right, left and right, center, and scale. At the moment, we just used right, left, and as for the vertical, we used only the top option. Now let's check out the other options. So now I'm going to move it right here, and imagine you want this element to stay at the center of this frame all the time, no matter how big it gets or how small it gets. To do that, the vertical constraint should be top, it doesn't matter in this case, but the horizontal constraint should be changed to center. When we do that, look what happens. You see, it maintains its position right in the middle of this frame, its parent frame. But at the moment, we only set the horizontal constraint to center, not the vertical one. What if you wanted to put this circle right here at the center of this frame? So you can just place it here. And then, as you can see, as soon as I align it to the center, both vertically and horizontally, Figma will change the vertical constraint automatically to center. And now, if I select this frame and I try to resize it, this circle stays right here in the middle, both horizontally and vertically all the time. Look what happens. You see that? All right, now let's take a look at the other option, left and right. I'm going to set it to left and right. And now look what happens when I modify this frame's dimension. You see, it tries to stretch this element from left and right. So basically what Figma does is maintain the left padding and the right padding here, the pixel value. So here, if we check the left and right padding, the left padding is 422. Here, the right padding is 423. And if I set it to left and right, and I try to adjust the frame's dimension, okay, now I can check the padding once again. We still get the exact same padding. That's why this circle is stretched. But we also have another option, okay? Here we have scale. I'm gonna undo it. I'm gonna hit Ctrl-Z or Command-Z. And now I'm gonna change its horizontal constraint to scale. Let's see how it works. I'm gonna select this desktop frame and I'm gonna modify its width. You see, again, this circle is stretching. So what's the difference between the scale option and the left and right option? So here is the difference. When you use the scale constraint, Figma will calculate everything based on percentage. So it converts all the values to percentage. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. I'm going to select this circle and I'm going to change its width and height to 200, just like this. Its height should be 200 as well. and let's put it right here at the center. And now I'm going to select this desktop frame and I'm going to change its width and height. So here I'm going to change it to 400 and the height is going to be 400. Okay. So when we set the constraints to scale like this, as I said, Figma will calculate everything based on percentage. So here, the dimensions of this particular circle, this element, are set to 200 and 200. And the dimensions of this frame are 400 and 400. So basically, this circle is taking up 50% of the width and of the height of this frame. And when we try to modify the width here, everything will be calculated based on percentage. So if I set the width here to 800, so we basically increased it by 100%, Figma will increase the width of this element by 100%. I'm going to select this ellipse, and there it is. Now we have 400 instead of 200. So that's the main difference between the scale constraint and the left and right constraints. Now let me show you how you can combine constraints with auto layout to truly use the power of these two beautiful features. Here on the right side, I put this card that we created in the previous lesson, in the auto layout lesson. And as you may remember, we just used auto layout to make it responsive. So it's fully responsive. So now imagine you created this screen and here the dimension is 1440. Okay, and you want to make sure that this card stays right at the center and it grows and shrinks when we increase or decrease the width of this frame. The way we can do that is like this. First of all, let me select it and I'm going to change the constraints back to top and left. And let me show you how it works. Nothing changes here, obviously. And now I'm going to select this card and I'm going to change the constraints to left and right. Now look what happens when I try to resize its parent frame, okay, this desktop. You see that? It shrinks and everything is responsive and also it grows just like this. So basically Figma is trying to maintain the left and right padding as you can see right here. Now imagine you just want to make sure that this card stays right at the center and you don't want it to be responsive. In that case, we just need to set the constraints to center and top. Just like this, it stays right at the center and it's no longer responsive. Now, let me show you another example. If you remember in the previous lesson, we also created this nav bar. So here we have this desktop frame and imagine you want to put this nav bar right here, right at the top of this desktop frame. Since it's responsive, we can simply adjust its width. Right here, we can increase it or decrease it. By the way, if you want to modify the width from both sides, you can hold down the Option or Alt key on your keyboard, left click and drag just like this. And I'm going to set it to maybe 1100. Let's suppose our container size is 1100. And we want to make sure that we always get this 170 pixel left and right padding. So you know what to do. You just need to select this nav bar, set the constraints to left and right and top, just like this. And now, if the user has a larger screen, something larger than 1440 pixels, look what happens. You see this nav bar is responsive now. And no matter how big it gets, we still get this 170 pixel right and left padding. And that's how we should make our design responsive. Once we start working on a real world project, I'll show you how you can apply all these things to a project from scratch. So don't worry. At the moment, I'm just showing you a few use cases, a few common use cases of auto layout and constraints. But later, we will combine everything to create a product from scratch. All right, there are a few things that I want to point out about constraints. The first one was that obviously you cannot set constraints to elements that are outside a frame. We already talked about it. The other point is that you can add constraints to frames that are inside other frames. So there is no limitations in that regard, which is very good. And also keep in mind that the elements inside an auto layout frame cannot have constraints. So here we have this nav bar. If I try to select one of these child objects, maybe this logo, As you can see, the constraints section is gone. That's because we cannot set constraints for elements of an auto layout frame. But what about this? This navbar is basically an auto layout frame. Yes, however, this navbar auto layout frame is now inside this desktop frame, which is not using auto layout. And basically, this navbar is the child of this desktop frame. That's why we can set constraints for that. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about the styling options in Figma, specifically the fill, the stroke, and the effects panels. So let's get into it and see how they work. First of all, I'm going to create a frame here. I'm going to hit A on my keyboard to select the frame tool. And from here, I'm going to pick this desktop frame. There it is. Let's start with the fill property. Well, basically the fill property allows you to add colors to your elements. It could be a text layer, it could be a shape. Any kind of element in Figma can have a fill. So here, when you add a frame or when you draw a frame just like this, Figma will automatically add a white fill to it, as you can see right here. So I'm going to remove this one and I'm going to select this frame. If you head over to the fill section, here we have a few properties. If I click on this white square, this color picker pops up and it allows you to adjust the color however you want. We have many properties here that we are going to talk about. Here we have two sliders. This first one is the hue slider, which allows you to change the hue just like this. And the bottom one is the alpha slider, which allows you to control the transparency of your element. So if you want to make an element transparent, you can decrease its opacity or the alpha property just like this, and then you'll get transparency. If you open up this drop-down menu, you will see a few color modes. We will talk about these options and specifically this panel in a dedicated section about colors, so we are not going to dive into the details of these properties. But for now, I just want you to know that it exists. Here you can type the hex color code. Basically, any color that's rendered by a computer is recognized by this specific hex color code. Each color has a unique hex color code. So here we have FFF, which is the color code of pure white. If I set it to pure black, I'll get 000000. What do we have here? Right at the top, we have this drop-down menu. Basically, a fill has different types. By default, it's set to solid. So solid allows you to add one color to your frame or to your element, just like what you see. It's either pure white or red or black. But if I open up this drop-down menu, you will see that we have other options as well, like linear, radial, angular, diamond, image, and video. Let's see what these options are. Here we have 4 different types of gradients: linear, radial, angular, and diamond. So if I set it to linear, look what happens. This creates a linear gradient, which is the most popular type of gradient. A gradient is basically a transition from one color to another color. So here, if you want to go from, let's say, red to orange, you can select this color right here, set it to red. Then you can select this one and change the hue slider right here and just set it to orange. And then you can just increase the opacity of the second color to 100% and you'll get this beautiful gradient. When it comes to gradients, you are not limited to only 2 colors. You can add more colors to this gradient if you just hover over this line here, or if you just click somewhere around here, you can add more colors to it. So I can simply adjust it to whatever color I want, just like this. Using this handle, you can modify the direction of the gradient. You can modify the position of these colors like that. And also here we have this circle, which allows you to define how much you want this gradient to spread. At the moment, you cannot see the effect, but when we change the type of gradient to something else, you can check it out and then you'll see how it works. Alright, so let's move on to the next type of gradient, which is radial. It just looks like this. It creates this ring shape, just like this. That's why it's called radial. And now you can see how this particular circle affects your gradient, just like this. Next, we have Angular. It allows you to create this kind of gradient. And finally, we have the diamond gradient, which looks like a diamond, as you can guess from its name. But the most popular type of gradient, as I mentioned, is linear. So most of the time we use the linear gradient. I rarely use these types of gradients. But what about these two? Do you remember when we talked about images in Figma? I mentioned that there are many ways to import your images to your Figma project, but we didn't talk about this option. The other way you can import images to Figma is by just adding a fill to your frame and then just change its type from solid to image right here. And then you can just click on choose image, and from here you can pick your desired image and it will be added to your frame. In this case, our frame, it could be a rectangle, it could be a smaller frame inside, it could be any kind of shape. And here you have access to a few preferences like what you see on your phone. You can adjust the exposure, you can adjust the contrast, you can adjust the saturation, the temperature, tint, highlights, and shadows. Sometimes these are very handy because sometimes we need to modify these preferences to make sure that our images look good and look saturated enough in our interface. Once you set this to image and once you pick your desired image, this drop-down menu appears. If I open it up, you will see that there are 4 options: fill, fit, crop, and tile. By default, it's set to fill, and it means that this image tries to take up the whole available space within this particular frame. So here, if I try to resize it, as you can see, it tries to take up the whole available space. What about fit? When I set it to fit, look what happens. Now it tries to maintain its original aspect ratio and it tries to fit inside this frame. The next one is crop. So whenever you want to crop your image, you can set it to crop here and then you can simply crop it just like this. And then you can hit enter and it will be cropped. And finally, we have tile. It basically creates a pattern like this. Your image is duplicated multiple times. And if you just decrease this value to something lower, this pattern will be much smaller. We usually don't use this tile option, but know that it exists. You can rotate your image right here as well if you want to. And you can also add video to your frames. However, this option is only available to paid users. So if you have a free account, you cannot use this option, unfortunately. All right, let me close this panel. Now that you know how the fill works, let me talk about these options right here. First of all, you can adjust the opacity of this fill layer right here. You can just decrease it or increase it depending on your needs. You can hide a fill just like that, or you can remove it entirely if you just click on this minus button. Keep in mind that a fill works like a layer. So you can keep adding different layers of fill to this fill section, to this particular frame. If I just click on this plus button, look what happens. Now another fill has been added to it, and this is basically a solid color with a 20% opacity. That's why we get this dark overlay effect. If you want to make it darker, you can just increase this value just like this. You can also rearrange these layers. If you just hover over this area right next to this square, your cursor changes to this hand icon. And you can left click and drag and just move them around just like this. All right, cool. That's all about the fill option. Now let's move on to the stroke option. I'm going to get rid of this frame. I'm going to remove it and I'm going to add a shape here. I'm going to add a rectangle just like this. So what's a stroke? Basically, strokes are a collection of properties that can be applied to different elements. It could be frames, it could be shapes, it could be images, etc. Generally, it allows you to add border to your elements. So here, let's consider this rectangle. Imagine you want to add some border to it. So what you can do is select this rectangle, hit this plus icon, just like that. And now a stroke has been added to this particular rectangle. Here we have a few properties. We have this paint property, which works the exact same way as the fill property. You can just adjust the color using this color picker. I'm going to change it to maybe this red color. You can change the thickness or the weight of your stroke like this. I'm gonna set it to 20. But here we have this drop down menu which defines the position of your stroke. It's so important. Let me show you why. By default, it's always set to inside, unless you create a line using the shape line tool. If I open up this drop down menu, you'll see that we have two other options, center and outside. So what's the difference? Let me just set the width here to 600 and the height to 300. So when it's set to inside, this stroke will be added to the inner part of this rectangle. So it doesn't change the main dimensions of this shape. But when it's set to outside, just like this, you will see that the width and height are intact. However, now this stroke has been added to the outer part of this boundary. As you can see here, we have this rectangle boundary, this blue line, and it has been added outside this boundary. What about center? When I set it to center, now the boundary of this rectangle is placed right in the middle of this stroke. So basically the stroke has been added to the inner and to the outer parts of this rectangle. Alright, cool. I'm gonna set it back to inside. And now let's talk about this option. When I click on this option, by default it's set to all, which means that the stroke will be added to all sides of this rectangle. But we can also add this stroke to one particular edge, for example, top or bottom or left or right. You can also click on custom, and here you can adjust the thickness of your stroke for each line independently. For example, if you want the left stroke, this left side, to have a much thicker stroke, you can just simply increase this just like that, and the bottom one can be decreased like this, or can be removed entirely. Alright, I'm gonna set it back to all, and I'm gonna decrease the thickness to 20. Now let's talk about the advanced stroke settings right here. If I click on this dot icon, you will see this advanced stroke panel, and here we have a few options. By default, the stroke style is set to solid. That's why we see this solid line. But we can also change it to dash if you want to create a dashed line. If I set it to dash, I can adjust the dash and gap values to just customize this dashed line, just like this. Let me just increase it. You see that? I can make it smaller or much larger. And also I can specify the gap here. By default, it's automatically set by Figma, but I can set it manually as well. So I can set it to 60 instead of 30. Here we have another property called dash cap. By default, it's set to none. That's why we see this rectangular dash line. But we can also set it to square like this, or round to make it rounded. If I just go ahead and decrease the thickness and also set it to center, you'll see the complete dashed line. Okay, what about this option, the join option? It basically allows you to define how two lines join within a path. So by default, it's set to mirror. I'm gonna set it to bevel, and look what happens to our stroke. You see that? It has been beveled a little bit. You can just change it to round as well. Alright, now I'm going to show you another example. As you may remember, I mentioned that this line shape tool and this arrow shape tool are also strokes. So if I go ahead and create a line here, just like this, if I hold down the shift key on my keyboard, I can create a straight line. As you can see, it's a stroke and I can adjust its thickness. But apart from all the properties we talked about, we also have these two properties, the ending points. These properties allow you to modify the styling of the starting point and the ending point. So let me change the color here to red, and I'm going to change the starting point to maybe line arrow, and the ending point to maybe something else, maybe triangle arrow. We can also set them to round, just like this, to create a rounded line. When you create a custom path using the pen tool or the pencil tool, you will also get these properties, just like this. You see, it's basically a stroke, and you can adjust its color, you can adjust its thickness, you can adjust these starting and ending points as you wish. Alright, that's all about stroke. Now let's move on to the next point, which is effects. So now let me create a frame right here. And I'm going to place a rectangle right inside. So I'm going to draw a rectangle. Right under the stroke section, we have this effects section. I'm going to click on this plus button to add an effect to this particular rectangle, just like this. And here by default, the effect is set to drop shadow. Generally, we have 4 different types of effects in Figma: the inner shadow, the drop shadow, the layer blur, and the background blur. So let's see how they work. The drop shadow allows you to create some shadow behind your element. In this case, behind our rectangle. So it allows you to add shadow outside this element. The inner shadow allows you to add some shadow inside this element. And we will talk about these two in a few minutes. But first, let me show you how you can modify these effects. If you click on this sun icon, this effects settings panel pops up. And here you have some properties. You can specify the X and Y coordinates. You can move your shadow horizontally and vertically like this. You can increase the blur value just like that to make it softer. You can increase the spread just like this. And finally, you can modify the color. And here you can decrease or increase the opacity of your shadow. So if you want to make it lighter, you can just decrease it to maybe 10%. If you want to make it darker, you can just increase it to maybe 50%. The same properties apply to the inner shadow. So you can adjust the blur, you can adjust the spread, and all the other properties. But what about these two, the layer blur and the background blur? Well, the layer blur allows you to make your element blurry, okay? As simple as that. So no matter what kind of element you have, whether it's a shape or an icon or an image, it will make it blurry. So let me just add an image here. I'm gonna create a frame just like this, and I'm gonna add a fill to it, and I'm gonna go ahead and add an image just like this, okay? Now, let's suppose we wanna make it blurry. We can simply select it, add an effect to it, change the effect to layer blur, and there it is, it's blurry. We can change the blur amount like this, and this way you can create this kind of effect. But what about the background blur? This one is interesting. Let me show you how it works. I'm gonna remove this layer blur from this image, and I'm gonna remove this shape as well. Let's make it a little bit larger. Now I'm gonna place a shape right here, maybe a circle. The background blur effect allows you to make this area blurry, okay? Whatever you see through this shape. But I just applied it to this circle, but nothing happened. You may say that we need to increase this value here. Let me show you. Nothing changes. That's because this effect only works if you make this layer transparent. How? You can decrease the opacity or the alpha value of this particular fill. So here, if I head over to the fill section, I can simply decrease the opacity, and now you see that whatever we see through this circle is blurry. So that's all about styling in Figma. We talked about fill, stroke, and effects. So I'll see you in the next video. Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we talked about styling options in Figma. We talked about the fill, the stroke, and the effects. In this video, we're going to talk about something called text and color styles. Let's dive in and see how it works. I'm gonna go ahead and create a frame here. I'm gonna hit A on my keyboard, draw a custom size frame, and I'm gonna create a text layer. Let's hit T to select the text tool, left click to create a text layer, and here I'm gonna type heading, just like this. And I'm gonna make it a little bit larger. Maybe let's set it to 36. Just like that. I can make it black, and I think that's fine. So we set these properties. Now imagine you want to use the exact same properties for other text layers. Let me create an iPhone 14 frame here, just like this. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this heading right here. So let's change it to title, like that. Imagine you want to use this particular typeface with this particular weight and font size for all your titles within your frames. How can you do that? Well, of course, you can set these properties again and again for all your text layers, or you can just duplicate this text layer, bring it over to the next frame. Let me just create another iPhone 14 frame. You can simply duplicate it, move it right here and just change the text. That's one way, but it's not efficient and it's not smart. Why? Imagine you have hundreds of different pages like this, okay? And on all these pages, you have this particular title with this specific typeface and font size and font weight. Now imagine you want to change the typeface entirely. At the moment we are using Inter. Imagine you want to change it to something else like Roboto. How can you do that? Well, you can just select them all or select them one by one and then go ahead and modify all these properties. But it's not a good way, it's not practical, because if you have hundreds of different pages like this, it would be too time consuming and frustrating to go through this process. So how can we fix this issue? Well, we can use something called text styles. So a text style basically saves our properties, our text properties that we set for a text layer, and it allows us to reuse those properties again and again whenever we need them. So let me show you how it works. I'm gonna select this text layer with all these properties, and to create a text style, I'm gonna click on this little icon in the text section, which says style. As soon as I do that, this text style page pops up. Here I can click on this plus icon and it says create new text style. Here I can name my text style. Let's name it H1 or heading 1. Here you can enter a description as well, but that's optional. I'm gonna leave it as is. I'm gonna hit create style. As soon as I do that, you will see that this H1 text style has been created. But how can we reuse that? It's so simple. If I go ahead and create another frame here, and if I try to create a new text layer, just like this, by default, Figma will choose this H1 text style for this text layer. But imagine you have multiple text styles, all right? So in that case, this is how it works. Let me detach this text from its text style. To detach a text from its text style, you can just select it and click on this chain icon, which says detach style. And now this text layer is no longer connected to its text style. So whenever you want to use the H1 text style, you can select your text layer, head over to the text section, and from here, you can find all your text styles and you can just click on it and this text style will be applied to this text layer. So now let me show you how you can actually modify text styles. Here I'm gonna type trending, just like this. I'm gonna duplicate this frame and here I'm gonna type popular. I'm gonna duplicate it and here I'm gonna type movies. So basically we have 4 different screens with different titles. Now imagine you decide to change the font size of all these titles. How can you do that? It's quite simple. Since one particular text style has been applied to all these text layers, if we make our change to the text style itself, that change will be reflected in all these text layers as well. So let me show you how it's done. I'm gonna select this title. It doesn't matter which one of these you choose because we are gonna make that change to the text style itself. I'm gonna head over to the text style. Let's click on it. Once this window pops up, you can just hover over your desired text style, the selected text style, and just click on this icon, which says edit style. Once you do that, all these text properties appear. So if you want to change the typeface to maybe Roboto, you can simply adjust it here. Let me just type Roboto, and there we go. All these text layers have been changed. If you want to change the weight, you can do that, just like this. If you want to make them larger, you can just do that, just like this. Keep in mind that when you create a text style, the color of your text layer doesn't matter. So here, if this title is red, it doesn't affect other titles, okay? Because a text style only stores the information about the text properties. Now let me show you how you can create different categories of text styles. So here we created this H1. Now imagine you want to create a category called heading, and under that category you want to have H1, H2, H3 different heading styles. To do that, you just need to rename your text style here. I'm gonna click on this edit style icon, and here before the name of this text style, I'm gonna type the category name that I'm looking for. I'm going to type heading, then a forward slash, just like this. And now what we did is basically we created this particular category, heading, and under that category, we placed this H1 style. So now as you can see, this category has been created. If I want to create another text style, I can just simply duplicate this, move it down. Before I make changes to this text layer, I need to detach it from its previous style. So here, I'm going to click on this chain icon. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, maybe 28, just like this. And now I can just create another text style. And here I'm going to name it heading forward slash H2. I'm going to hit create style and we are basically done. Now we have two styles under this heading style. Later when we start creating our design system, I'll show you how to utilize the text styles properly. But for now, I just wanted you to know how text styles work and how you can customize them. All right, similar to text styles, we can also create color styles to store the properties of the fill section here. How can we do that? It's quite simple. Let's suppose you have a simple shape with a particular color, maybe this purple, all right? And you want to save this color as a color style. What you can do is select this rectangle, head over to the fill section and just click on this icon. And this window pops up, color styles, hit this plus icon. And just like creating text styles, here you need to name your color styles. So let's create a category. I'm going to type primary forward slash 600. This is the weight of this color. We will talk about it later, so don't worry about this particular number. I'm going to hit create style, just like this. And now whenever I want to use this particular color for any element, I don't need to pick it from the color picker. I can simply select the element that I want to apply this color to, for instance, this text layer. And then I can head over to the fill section, click on this little icon, and from here, I can find my primary 600 purple color, just like this, and it will be applied to that particular element. You can apply it to any kind of element. It could be a shape. Let me create a circle here. It could be a text, anything. Now I'm going to create another color style under this particular color category. So I'm going to duplicate this rectangle, move it to the right. First, we need to detach it from its previous style, just like this. And then I'm going to make it a little bit darker, just like this. And I'm going to create another style. So let's call it primary forward slash 900. And now if I want to change the color of these elements to primary 900, I can just select this element, head over to the color style section, and from here I can switch to the 900 style. So that's basically how you can create text styles and color styles. By the way, you can also create stroke styles, effect styles, etc. But the process is exactly the same, so we are not gonna repeat that again and again. Before we wrap up this lesson, I want to mention something else. If you just click somewhere on your canvas like this, on the right side you'll see that in the design panel all the properties will be gone and you'll see all your local styles here. You have your text styles, you have all the categories, you have your color styles. So keep in mind that you can access all your text styles and color styles right here if you just click somewhere in your canvas. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about components in Figma. What are components? Well, in simple words, components are reusable elements. Imagine you are working on a large-scale project and you need to design more than 100 pages. And on each page, you need to use a button. Once you're done with the design process and the project is ready, you will deliver it, it will be developed, and everything is fine. Now imagine after a few months, the client or your boss or the company you work for decides to change the styling of those buttons on all those pages. How can you do that? Well, you might say that, all right, we can go ahead and change them one by one, or we can just select them all and modify them. Yes, you can, but it's so time consuming and it's not efficient. As a UI UX designer, we need to make sure to save time as much as we can. So we don't want to waste time. We need to devote our time to more important tasks rather than just repetitive tasks. So instead of doing that, we can create components and we can reuse those components. So let me show you an example that I just talked about. Let's go ahead and create a button here. Here I already prepared 2 icons. This is for the next example, but here I'm gonna create a button. To create a button, always start by creating a text layer. Don't create a rectangle and put your text inside. All right, let me type button. I'm gonna change the font size here to 16. Now to turn this text into a button, I'm gonna hit Shift and A to add auto layout to this text element, just like this. And as you can see, now this text is inside an auto layout frame. So we can rename this frame to button. And then we can go ahead and style it. For example, you can go ahead and add a fill to it if you want to get a contained button. However, if you want to get an outline button, you can add a stroke to it. For now, a fill would work. So I'm going to add a fill to it. I'm going to change its color to maybe purple, just like this. And next, we can simply modify the padding here. So I'm going to set the vertical padding to 12 and the horizontal padding to 16. And also I'm gonna make it a little bit rounded. So let's change the corner radius value to 4. So here is our button, and the reason I like creating buttons this way, and it's in my opinion the best way to create buttons, is because this button is responsive by default, since the resizing options are set to hug and hug. So here, if I decide to change the text here, I can just start typing like get started. And as you can see, this button is fully responsive. So let me hit Ctrl Z or Command Z. All right, so here is our button. Now I'm gonna go ahead and use this button. Let me create a frame right here. I'm gonna hit A on my keyboard. And from here, I'm gonna choose iPhone 14, just like this. And let's duplicate this button. I'm gonna select it, hit Ctrl D or Command D, and I'm gonna put it inside this frame, just like this. Now I'm gonna change its text to maybe sign in, okay? I'm gonna align it to the center. Now let's select this whole frame, duplicate the frame, and just change this text to maybe sign up, okay? Imagine we are designing 2 different pages, the sign in page and the sign up page. Now I'm gonna duplicate it once again, and here I'm gonna type confirm. So basically we use the exact same button 3 times on 3 different pages. Now imagine you want to modify the color of all these buttons. How can you do that? As I said, you can simply select these buttons one by one and go ahead and change their color to something else like this. Or you can just select them all, just hold down the Shift key and just click on them and change their color like this. That's one way, but imagine you have 100 different pages. Let me just duplicate these screens many times like this. It would be quite hard and time consuming to select all these buttons on all these pages and make those changes, right? So we need to use a better way. And that's when components come into play. Let me remove these additional frames. All right, so how can you create a component? It's so simple. To create a component, just select the element you want to convert to a component. In this case, it's our button. And then head over to the toolbar, and here right in the middle, right next to this mask button, you will find this create component button. If I click on it, look what happens. You see the blue boundary around this button turned purple, which indicates that this element is a component now. And also, if you take a look at its icon in the layers list, you see you'll get this new icon, which indicates that this is a master component. But how can you reuse this component? To reuse that, you have 2 ways. First, you can duplicate it. If I just select this, hit Ctrl D or Command D, I can move it down using the arrow keys on my keyboard. And here we have an instance of this component. Remember, when we create copies of a component, we call it instances of that component. And now we can modify this text just like this. I can just select the text. I'm gonna type get started, for instance. Now let me duplicate this instance once again. I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to change this text to sign in, and let's duplicate it once again and change the text to sign up. By the way, when you want to select an element inside a parent element directly, you can hold down the Control or Command key on your keyboard and just click on that particular element. So here, if I want to select this text, I can either double click on it like this, or I can hold down the Command or Control key and hover over this particular element and left click to directly select that. All right, so now I have 3 instances of this component. If you take a look at the layers list, you see that the instance of a component has a unique icon. You see that? Here we have the master component, this one, and the instances of this component have this particular icon, so you can easily differentiate between them. But here's the good part. Now imagine you used all these instances on different pages, and you suddenly decide to change the corner radius of these buttons. Maybe you want to make them completely rounded. To do that, you don't need to select them one by one and go ahead and modify them. You can, by the way, you can modify the styling of each instance individually. For example, you can select this Get Started button and increase its corner radius just like this, or change its color to something else. But that's not the point of using components, right? We use components so we can make some changes once, and those changes should be applied to all the instances of that component. Instead of doing that, I can select the master component with this icon, and I can make those changes to this master component. And now look what happens when I increase the corner radius. You see, the changes are reflected in all the instances. I can also change the color. I can also change the font size. I can just decrease the font size to 14, just like this. I can also change the padding if I want. The master component is linked to all its copies. So that's why we use components. We use components for buttons, for check marks, for any kind of UI element that we need to reuse again and again across our project. All right, so I showed you how you can create an instance of this component by just duplicating the master component. But as I mentioned before, there are other ways to create instances of your components. Whenever you create a component, that component will be stored in the Assets panel as well, right here next to the Layers panel. When you go to the Assets panel, under the Local Components, you will find your components, okay? And to create an instance of your components, you can just simply drag and drop it into your canvas or into your frame. The other thing you can do is go to the Resources tab right here in the toolbar. We didn't talk about it. If you open it up, here you have 3 different panels: Components, Plugins, and Widgets. Right under Components, you'll also get access to all your components. So you can simply create an instance of your components. All right, now that you've learned how to create components and how to create instances of your components, I'm going to show you how to create different categories of components as well. So let me get rid of all these instances. All right, so imagine we want to design different types of buttons. We will talk about UI elements later in this course, but for now, I'm just going to create 2 different types of buttons: primary and secondary buttons. So as for the primary button, I'm going to make sure that it's contained just like what we see here, but I'm going to create an outline button as for the secondary button. Let me adjust the padding here. I'm going to change it to 24. And now I'm going to head over to the layers list. And here I'm going to double click on its name to rename it. In order to create different categories of components, you need to add a / after the category name. So in this case, I'm going to name the category button. Then I'm going to type /, and here you need to name that button. In this case, it's going to be primary. So under the button category, we will have the primary button. Now I'm going to create the secondary button. To do that, let's duplicate this master component. I'm going to hit Ctrl+D or Command+D to create an instance of it. I'm going to move it down. Now I'm going to create another component. But to do that, first I'm going to detach this instance from its master component to break the connection between them. Right now they are connected because this is an instance of this component. But to detach it from its master component, I can right click on it and I can click on detach instance. Alternatively, you can head over to the design panel, and right here you'll see this particular section which is dedicated to components. If you click on this icon, you will be taken to the main component, the master component. But if you click on this icon, you will find detach instance as well. As soon as I click on it, it will be detached from its master component. And now it's just a simple auto layout frame. All right, for the secondary button, I'm gonna remove the fill and I'm gonna add a stroke to it, just like this. Let's increase the thickness. I'm gonna set it to 2. It should be inside, and I'm gonna change its color to this purple color. And the text color can be dark gray, just like this. We can bring it right here so you can see the text easily. All right, so now we need to turn this button into a component again. So I'm gonna select it and click on this create component. But here we have an issue. Both of them are named similarly. We can fix that easily. We can just double click on its name, and here instead of primary, I'm gonna type secondary, just like this. So now we have 2 components, and both of these components are part of this button category. Now if you head over to the assets tab, you can see that under local components you have this button category. The reason you see this iPhone 14 is because we put these inside this frame. So if I put these outside this frame, you'll only see the category name. Now we are going to talk about nested components. Here, as you can see, I prepared 2 different icons for you. We have a check mark icon and we have a download icon. Let's turn them into components. I'm going to select them both. When you want to turn multiple elements into components, you can just select them both and then open up this drop-down menu and click on create multiple components. And now we have these 2 components as well. If you take a look at the assets tab, we have the check mark and the download components. However, we don't have a category here. So let's put them inside the icon category. The only thing you need to do is add icon before their name, just like this. I'm gonna type icon /download. And now we have this icon category. One of the most important features of components is nesting components. Let me show you how it works. Here we have these 2 components, right? We have the primary button, we have the secondary button. Imagine you want to place an icon inside this button. Well, you could just put an icon simply inside. Since it's an auto layout frame, it will be responsive, but every time you want to change that icon, you need to go ahead and remove that icon and replace it with another one. However, there is a better way. You can turn your icons into components like what I did here, and then use instances of your icons inside this button. That's why we call it nesting components. We can nest components inside other components. Keep in mind that we shouldn't put the master component inside another component. All right, this is a very common mistake among beginners. You need to create an instance of that component and then nest it inside other components. So I'm going to select this checkmark icon. I'm going to duplicate it to create an instance, just like this. And I'm going to drag and drop it inside this primary button. Since it's an auto layout frame, it's responsive. You can select the button, you can change the alignment to center. Here I'm going to specify the horizontal spacing to 4. And now our button component has an icon as well. Now let me go ahead and create an instance of this button. I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to put the instance somewhere around here inside this frame. Imagine I want to change this icon. For example, I'm going to change it to download. And I want to change this checkmark icon with a download icon. Since we used nested components, here as you can see we have an instance of the icon component, I can just select it, and here I can open up this drop down menu and just swap it with another icon. Just like this, as simple as that. So that's how nested components work in Figma. The next topic we are going to talk about is component properties. Imagine you created this button and you try to reuse it again and again and again, like this. You place an instance of this button right here. You can place an instance of it on another page. Let me just get rid of these buttons. I'm going to place it right here. Okay. and you want to change the content of this button. For example, you want to change the text, or you want to swap the icon, or maybe you want to hide the icon entirely, because when we create a design system, you may need to have a button without icon, you may need to have a button with icon, with different variations. How can you do that? Well, one way is to just simply select the child of this parent component. In this case, the child items are the icon and the label, right? So you can hold down the command key or control key on your keyboard, direct select that element, and double click on it and start modifying the text. That's one way, and I already showed you how you can modify this icon as well. You can just select it and swap it here. That's one way, and it's fine, you can use that, but there is a better way as well, a more organized and a more neat way. That's when component properties come into play. How can you create component properties? There are two ways. I'm going to show you both of them. So here, let's imagine you want to create a component property to be able to change the text once you select the parent element. So you don't need to select the child items. To do that, you can select this text inside the master component, not the instance. That's so important. Keep in mind, when you want to create component properties, you need to work with your master component. I'm going to select the text, and if I head over to the design panel, here we have this content section. This content section allows you to modify the content of this button, the content of this text basically. So I can change it to something else, for example, sign in. Just like this. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z. As you can see here, we have this button. If I click on it, this modal window pops up. It says create component property. Any component property has two different fields, the name and the value. So here for the name, we are gonna leave it as is. It should be text, and the default value can be button. Of course, you can change it if you wanna have another default value, but button works best here. I'm gonna hit create property. Now, as you can see, a property has been created here, and this text property is linked to the content of this text layer. You may ask, what happens now? Well, here is what happens. Now, if you select any instance of this component, the parent element, okay, the button primary instance here, you will see that under this section, this property appears, the text property that we just created. And here you can simply modify the content. I'm going to change it to sign in, and there it is. So you no longer need to select the child element of this instance and double click on it and modify it. You can directly select the instance and just modify all the properties that you created right here. But this is only one type of property that you can create for your components. You can create different types of properties. Now let me show you how you can hide this icon. So here, I'm gonna get back to this master component, and I'm gonna double click on this icon check mark. As soon as it's selected, I can head over to the layer section here, to the layer property, and I'm gonna click on this one. This one allows you to create a Boolean property. A Boolean property allows you to set the value to either true or false, or maybe on or off. It works like a light switch. So I'm gonna click on it, and here I'm gonna change the name to has icon, and the value is set to true. I'm gonna leave it as is because here we have an icon, so the value should be true, and I'm gonna hit create property. So now we created a Boolean property for this icon. Now if I select the instance of this button, look what happens. We have this new property under the text property, and this is basically a switch. That's because we created a Boolean property, and a Boolean property, as I mentioned, only has two values, either on or off, true or false. So it says has icon, and the switch is on. I'm gonna toggle it off, just like that. The icon is gone. All right, so far we created a text property and a Boolean property. But what if we want to be able to swap the icon used in this button right here? We can do that as well. To do that, we need to create another property. So here, I'm gonna select the icon again, and this time I'm gonna head over to this section. You see right next to this drop-down menu, which allows you to swap icons, right? That I already showed you. And now I'm going to click on this one, create instance swap property. And here I'm gonna set the name to icon. And for the value, you need to pick an icon from your local components. It could be the check mark, the download. It's basically the default icon that appears whenever you create an instance of this button. I'm gonna set it to check mark, that's fine. And I'm gonna click on create property. And now if I select the instance of this button, we have this icon property as well. So I can easily swap this icon with another icon. So that's basically how component properties work. But there is one more property for components, and that's called the variant property. We are going to talk about variant properties in the next lesson, but for now, I'm going to show you another way of creating these properties. So first, I'm going to select this button, and I'm going to go ahead and remove these properties. If I select this main component, you'll see all its properties right here. We have a text property, we have a Boolean property, and a swap instance property. I'm going to click on this minus icon to delete the property one by one, and we are going to recreate these properties in another way. So now if I select the instance of this button, it has no component properties. So let's create them once again. This time, we are not going to select the child elements inside this component. Instead, we are going to select the main component. We are going to head over to the properties section. And if we click on this plus icon, we have the variant that we didn't talk about. We'll talk about it in the next lesson. We have Boolean, instance swap, and text. So we know that we are going to create a Boolean property to be able to hide or unhide our icon. So I'm going to click on it and I'm going to name it has icon. The value should be true. Create property. It shows you this exclamation mark here, and if you hover over it, it says not used within component. That's true because we didn't link this property that we just created to any of these child elements. That's fine, we are going to do that in a second. Now let's create another property. I'm going to hit this plus button, this time an instance swap. So I'm going to click on it and let's call it icon. The value is going to be icon check mark and create property. Good. Now we need a text property as well. So the name is going to be text. The default value is going to be button and hit create property. Okay, so we created all the properties we need for this button. Now it's time to link these properties to the child elements. I'm going to select the child element here, this icon instance inside this master component, and I'm going to head over to this section and I'm going to click on this, and now Figma doesn't open that create property modal. Here it shows us the icon property that we already created. Of course, if you want, you can go ahead and create a new property, but since we already created that, we are going to link that property to this icon instance. So I'm going to click on it, it's linked. While it's selected, let's head over to the layer section, and I'm going to click on this icon and link it with the has icon property, the Boolean property we created. Okay, now let's select the text and head over to the content section and just connect it with the text property, just like this. Now let's select our instance here. And as you can see, we have all these properties. We have the has icon property, the swap instance property, and the text property. If you want to change the order of these properties, you can select the master component, hover over this area, your cursor changes to this hand icon, and you can just drag it and move it around, just like this. Alright guys, that's all about components. In the next video, we will talk about another property of components called variant. So I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we talked about components and its properties. However, there was one property that we didn't talk about, and it was variance. So in this video, we are going to talk about the variant property and how you can utilize it properly. So let's dive in. First of all, I'm going to take this button primary component that we created in the previous lesson. I'm going to cut it from this page. I'm going to hit Ctrl X or Command X, and I'm going to bring it right here inside this variance page. I'm going to paste it here, Ctrl V or Command V. And here is our main component. There are times when we need to create different versions of the same component with a slight difference. For example, a button can have different states. We will talk about these later, but just know that a button or any other UI elements can have different states like default, hover, pressed. So what happens when the user hovers over this button? What happens when the user clicks on this button? Usually the appearance of the button should change slightly. So when you want to create variations of the same component, for example, the color could be changed, the size could be changed, etc., you can use the variant property. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to select this button component that we created before. And to create a variant, I can either head over to the toolbar here and click on this add variant button, just like this, and it will create this component set. Or let me just undo it. I can select this component. I can head over to the properties section, hit this plus button, and from here I can add a variant property to it. The only difference is that when you use this method, Figma won't duplicate this primary button, all right? You can go ahead and duplicate it by yourself. But when you use this method, when you use this icon here, as soon as it creates this component set, it will also duplicate this component and it will create a new variant. As you can see, we have primary and variant too. This is the main difference between these two methods, but apart from that, nothing else is different. All right, so here we have this component set and it's called button. Inside this component set, we have a few variants. We have the primary variant and we have variant 2. When you create a component set using this method, what you're doing is basically adding a variant property to these components, to these copies of your main component. So here, if I select this component set, as you can see, this property 1 has been added to all the properties that we previously added to this component. You can go ahead and rename it to whatever you want, but this is basically a variant property. So here, I'm going to rename it to state, as I'm going to change the state of this button. And now if I go ahead and select the variants inside, as you can see here, this current variant has one property, this state property. Don't confuse variant properties with the component properties because they might seem similar, but there is a difference between them. Here, each variant has a variant property that we just created, okay, that we added to this component set, but also these components have component properties that we previously added to these components. And when you select this component set, you'll see all the properties here, the component properties that we previously added, and also this variant property that also belongs to this component. But when we select these variants individually, we only see the variant properties. All right, so now if I select this primary variant, as you can see, the state is set to primary. I'm going to change it to default. And now if I select the second variant, as you can see, the value is set to variant 2. So I'm going to change this one to hover, just like that. And now I can go ahead and modify the appearance of this hover variant. So if I head over to the fill section, what I'm going to do is click on this plus icon to add an overlay fill layer to this fill section. Just like this. As soon as I do that, this new layer is going to be created and it's basically a black fill with a 20% opacity. So what I'm going to do is change this color to white since this is the hover state. I'm going to make it brighter rather than darker. And now I'm going to create another variant. To create another variant, you can simply select this one or the main one, it doesn't matter. I'm going to select this one and I'm going to duplicate it, hit Ctrl D or Command D. Or you can just select this one and click on this plus icon, just like this. So again, now it's asking us to set a value for this state property. This time I'm going to type pressed. This is going to be our pressed state. And I'm going to go ahead and change this fill to black. I'm going to make it darker. Maybe I can increase the opacity to 40. And now this button component has 3 different variants. But how can you use these variants? It's simple. If you head over to assets and from here you look for your components, if I just drag an instance of it and drop it right here, you'll see that apart from these properties that we previously added to this component, now we have this variant property as well. It's called state. I can change it to hover. I can change it to pressed, and I can get back to default. The good thing about this is that I can just set it to hover, for instance, or pressed, and then I can also customize these values. For example, I can just remove the icon or change the text just like this, or swap the icon. So basically this component set, or let's say variants, allow you to organize all your components within one simple container. So up until now, we created a one-dimensional component set, because here this component set only has one variant property, the state. The only thing that changes is the appearance of these buttons, the color, right? Now imagine you want to change something else as well, maybe the size of these buttons. In that case, you need to create a multi-dimensional component set, and it's so easy to do. Here, I'm gonna select this component set, this button component set, and I'm gonna make it a little bit larger, just like this. And I'm gonna select these three states, these three variants, and I'm gonna duplicate them. Hit Ctrl D or Command D. And here, as you can see, we have state 4, state 5, state 6, but we are not gonna add more states to this button. Instead, we are gonna change its size. So we need to add another property to this component set. How can we do that? It's so simple. Let me just move them right here. I'm not gonna set the values here because, as I said, we are gonna create a new property called size. So I'm gonna select the component set, and I'm gonna click on this plus icon, and I'm gonna click on variant to create a new variant property. Just like this. The name is gonna be size, and the value can be medium. This is gonna be the medium size. I'm gonna hit create property, just like that. And now we created another variant property. Now we need to select these variants and check the values of these properties. So the states are fine. The size is medium, that's also fine. What about these? I'm gonna select this. The state should be default. This one should be hover. This one should be pressed. And now Figma says the properties and values of this variant are conflicting. Change the applied values on this variant to resolve this. The reason is these variants have the exact same properties and values as these variants. So now we need to modify the size value for these variants. I'm going to change it to small. For this one as well, you can just select them both and change the value to small. And now that warning is gone. All right, so now we have these two properties. However, now we need to select these new variants and just change their size. So what I'm gonna do is decrease the padding here. I'm gonna decrease the vertical padding to 8 and the horizontal padding to 16. You can modify the font size as well, but I'm not gonna do that at the moment. It's fine. All right, we are ready to check it out. If I select this instance of this button that we already created, you can see that now we have the size property as well. So let me change the state to default. It should have an icon. The text is button, that's fine. Now I'm gonna make it small. So I can open up this drop-down menu and I can change it to small. Just like this, you'll get the small variant of this button with all the other properties. You can still modify these properties, the values of these properties, the text, you can switch the icon on or off, etc. Now I want you to go ahead and add 3 more variants to this component set, and these variants are going to be the larger buttons. So here we have the medium buttons, we have the small buttons, now we need the large buttons. Please pause the video, go ahead and do that by yourself, and then we'll do it together. Alright, I hope you could do it by yourself. Now let's do it together in case you faced any issues. So I'm gonna select these 3 variants again. We don't need to add another property because we are just changing the size property. We just need to duplicate these variants. I'm gonna duplicate them, hit Ctrl D or Command D. I'm gonna enlarge this component set to keep everything organized like that. And let's move these to the right. And these can be placed right here. Okay, so far so good. Now we need to go ahead and change the property values of these 3 variants. Okay, for this first one, the size property should be large. For these 2 as well, so I'm gonna select them both and I'm gonna change it to large. All right, now let's select them all. these three variants, and I'm going to change their padding here. I'm going to change the vertical padding to 16 and the horizontal padding to 32. And now if I select the instance of this button, we can change its size to large as well. One thing you can do to keep everything organized is add labels to your component set. So here I'm going to create a text layer, but make sure that this text layer is outside your component set. And I'm going to type large. I'm going to place it right here. I'm going to duplicate it, move it to the right side. This one is going to be named medium. And duplicate it, move it to the right. And this one is going to be small. Now I'm going to duplicate this one, bring it right here. And I'm going to type default, just like this. Duplicate it, bring it down. This one is going to be hover. Duplicate it, bring it down, and this one is gonna be pressed. So this way you can easily understand what's going on. This approach is especially good when you have many different variants. Imagine you have hundreds of different variants in a component set with different sizes, with different states. Maybe some of them have larger icons, some of them have smaller icons. This way you can make sure that everything is neat and organized. Welcome back! In the previous video, we talked about variants and how you can create a component set. In this video, we are going to talk about interactive components. Alright, let me show you what I mean by that. If I go to assets and if I just drag and drop an instance of this button right here, you see that we can change the state, right? We can change it to hover, we can change it to pressed, etc. But what if we want this component to be interactive? Well, we can do that by utilizing something called interactive components. So here is the way it works. If I head over to this component set, and here I select this default variant, I can go to the prototype tab. We didn't talk about the prototype tab in detail because, as I mentioned before, we have a dedicated prototyping section within this course. So we will talk about the prototyping tab in detail later. But now I just want to show you how you can make these variants interactive. When you select this component, this particular variant, and you head over to the prototype tab, you can hover over its boundary like this, and this circle with this plus icon inside appears. Now you can left click and drag to connect this particular variant to the second one, which is our hover state. And as soon as you do that, this interaction details window pops up. Here we have a few preferences. Right at the top, you can specify the trigger, and here you can specify the type of animation you want to create. The only thing I'm going to show you is how to change the trigger here. I'm going to change it to while hovering because basically here we are creating the hover effect, and the animation is set to instant. It's fine. Now look what happens when I select this component. Let me take a look at its properties. The size is large, that's fine. The state is set to default. And now if I select this button and if I put it inside a frame, let me just draw a frame here. I'm going to place it inside and I can just select this frame and hit play to preview this frame, just like this. Now look what happens when I hover over this button. You see, as soon as I hover over this button, we'll go to the next state, we'll go to the hover state. So that's how you can make your variants interactive. You can connect them together using the prototype tab, and you can specify the type of trigger, the type of animation, and basically you can create very complex interactions using variants. As I said, I'm not going to get into details because later on we'll have many lessons about prototyping, but for now I just wanted to show you how you can create connections between your variants. One thing to keep in mind is that when you create this connection, for example, for these large buttons, you need to go ahead and create the connection for the medium size and the small size as well. Because here, this interaction only works for the large variant because we only connected this large button, the default state, to the hover state of this large button. If I change the property here, the size property, from large to maybe medium, now if I go ahead and preview it, nothing happens when I hover over it. You see, nothing happens. So to fix this issue, you need to go ahead and select this default variant here for the medium size and just go to prototype, connect it to the next variant, the hover variant, change the trigger to while hovering, and now if we preview it, it works perfectly. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about layout grids in Figma. We already talked about layout grids in design in the design principles chapter, but in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a layout grid in Figma. First of all, in order to create a layout grid, you need to have a frame. So I'm going to hit A on my keyboard to select the frame tool. And from here, let's select the desktop frame, this one. Now, while your desktop frame is selected, you can just head over to the design panel on the right side, and here you can click on this plus button in the layout grid section. As soon as you do that, this grid will be added to this particular frame. Now to adjust this layout grid, you can click on this icon right here and this panel pops up. Here you can change the size of your grid and the color. And here, as you can see, the size is set to 8, which means that each of these squares has a dimension of 8 by 8. So if I create a simple rectangle here, look what we get here. The width is set to 8, the height is set to 8 as well. So let me just remove that. But usually most of the time we don't use this grid type. If you want, you can use it. Some designers use this grid type, but we usually use a column grid for web design and nowadays for mobile application design as well. I'm going to change it to columns here. And as you can see, now we have 5 different columns. Here you can specify the number of columns you want to get. You can change the color to whatever color you want. It's optional. And here we have other properties that are so important. We have the type. By default, it's set to stretch. And it means that here we have a fluid layout grid. What does it mean? It means that if I go ahead and adjust the dimension of this frame, this layout grid will shrink or grow. So it's basically fluid, just like this. With this type of layout grid, we can specify 2 properties. The margin, which is the space around these columns on the sides. At the moment it's set to 0. I can change it to maybe 48, just like this. You see this empty space on the sides, and the gutter property, which defines the space between these columns. Okay, at the moment it's set to 20. You can increase it or decrease it. I'm going to increase it to 32, and you'll get a 32 pixel gutter. So here, as you can see, you cannot change the width, and it says auto. That's why this layout grid is responsive. It's fluid because the width of these columns will be adjusted based on the changes we make to the screen's dimension, just like this. So the only things you can specify are the margin and the gutter. Okay, but we also have other types. We have center, right, and left. If I set it to center, look what we get. Now instead of margin, we have this offset, which you cannot change, and we have width and gutter. So now you can specify the width of your columns. I'm gonna set it to 64, just like this, and the gutter, 32 looks fine. And here I can increase the count to 12. And this layout grid is not responsive. So the layout grid always stays right in the middle of our frame. If I go ahead and resize my frame, as you can see, it stays where it is, and the width of these columns is fixed. That's why it's called a fixed layout grid. So basically we have 2 types of layout grids. We have a fluid layout grid and a fixed layout grid. So whenever you want to create a fixed layout grid, you need to set the type to center. Whenever you want to create a fluid layout grid, you need to set the type to stretch. Once we start working on a project, I'll show you how to set these values and just adjust these properties to create the best layout grids for your projects. The other types are right and left. When you use these 2 types of layout grids, you'll get access to this additional property, which is offset. If you set it to left, it starts from here. If I set the offset to 0, it will start from the left edge of your frame, and you can offset it using this offset property, just like that. And the opposite of left is obviously right, so it starts from the right side and you can offset it to the left. So that's how you can create a layout grid in Figma. And keep in mind that you can save these layout grids as well. Just like color styles and text styles, you can click on this little icon right here and you can create grid styles as well. The other type of layout grid is rows. So instead of having columns, you'll get vertical rows, just like this. We usually use this rows layout grid when we want to decide the height of our elements. So when we want to have some kind of vertical rhythm, we can create this row vertical grid. We can increase the count here to 1000, something huge. And then you can set the type to top. So it starts from the top of the screen. And after that, you can set the gutter and height to either 8 or 4. If you use a 4-point grid system, you can set it to 4 and 4, just like this. And now, whenever you create an element, let's create a rectangle just like this. Imagine you want to create a nav bar, okay? And you're not sure about its height. And you want to make sure that all your numbers are divisible by 4. In this case 4, since I set everything to 4. In that case, this kind of grid could be helpful. So you can easily align your elements and you shouldn't worry about the height of your elements anymore. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about plugins. What are plugins? Plugins are basically third-party pieces of software that add more functionalities to Figma. It's its simplest definition. And Figma has lots of plugins. These plugins are usually developed by developers or designers. You can even develop your own plugins, and you can find them in the community page. In this video, I'm going to show you how to run and use plugins. I'm going to show you some use cases, and attached to this video, you'll find a list of plugins that are so useful. All right, so let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to create a frame here, hit A to select the frame tool, and just draw a frame. And now I'm going to create a few circles. Just like this. I'm going to duplicate it, hit Ctrl D or Command D. Imagine you want to create 5 different profile images, just like that. So you create these circles, and now you need to place some images inside. If you have those images, that's good. You can just store them on your computer and just go to File, from here, choose image from your computer. That's fine. But most of the time, we don't have those images. And that's also fine because there are many plugins that allow us to insert images, royalty-free images, to these placeholders instantly. So let me show you how it's done. I'm going to select these circles and I'm going to head over to the Resources tab right here. And right next to this Components tab, we have this Plugins tab as well. Here is where you can find plugins that are available in the community. You can scroll down here. And if you want to browse more plugins, you can click on this Browse More in Community and you'll be taken to the community just like this. Let me show you. Here is the community page. You can, of course, go ahead and use this search bar to look for a specific thing. It could be a plugin, it could be a design system, it could be a UI kit, it could be an icon library, etc. But if I scroll down, here we will be taken to this section. I'm going to look for plugins only for Figma, and it can be paid or free. If you're looking for free plugins, just select free here. And here is a list of popular plugins. We have Autoflow, we have Noise, we have Rapid Copywriting, etc. And to try them out, you can simply click on Try It Out and you'll be taken to a Figma file where you can check it out. Alternatively, if you know the name of plugin you are looking for, you can simply look for it right here within your project. So I know the plugin that I'm going to run. I'm going to look for a plugin called Content Reel. There it is. I'm going to run it. All right, let's hit next, and start. This plugin is basically a library of different assets like images, icons, and also some text such as full name, lorem ipsum text, date, US full address, US phone number, US currency. If you go to the text section here, there are many different libraries here. Job title, numbers, fake company names, etc. These are so helpful because most of the time when you start working on a project, you use fake data. And it's fine, especially if you don't have any client and you just want to redesign a project or you just want to create a concept project. But instead of just having some placeholder text, it's better to use this plugin where you can find some random fake data like job titles, fake company names, USCT, date, etc. So first, let me show you how you can utilize its image library. If you go to the image tab, here as you can see, there are many libraries created by many people. These two libraries are created by Microsoft. So if you just open it up, you'll be taken to all these photos. And here, if I click on apply all, look what happens. There we go. These images have been inserted to these circles. Isn't it cool? And if you are not satisfied with these images, you can just click on apply all once again, and they will be changed. Of course, you can go ahead and select these circles one by one and choose one of these images by yourself. But if you want to quickly populate data, you can just select all your placeholders and just click on this apply all. Now let's check out its text properties. For example, I'm going to create a text layer here and I'm going to type name. All right. It's way too big. I'm going to detach it from my text style and I'm going to decrease the font size down to 16 and it should be medium, just like this. I'm going to duplicate it, hit Ctrl D or Command D and move it down. Let's duplicate it a few times. Imagine you need to have 6 different names. So you select them all, you head over to the text library here, and from here, I'm going to click on full name, first, last. You can also populate US full address, just like this, lorem ipsum, date, US phone number, company names, US currency, etc. Make sure to check them out, they are so helpful. You can also find this icon library here. I personally do not suggest to use these libraries. There are some other good plugins that you can use for icons. You can find them in the list attached to this video. Alright, that was our first plugin. The other plugin I'm gonna mention is the Unsplash plugin. I'm not sure if you know or not, but Unsplash is basically a website that provides you with royalty-free images that you can use for free in your personal or commercial projects, which is awesome. So you don't need to pay for them. Here is the website. You can look for a specific word, a specific location, or you can just go to these categories. For instance, 3D renders, just like this. You can click on this one, download it, and bring it to Figma. But you don't need to do that because you can use its dedicated plugin. Here I'm going to go to resources and I'm going to look for Unsplash. I'm going to run it here and there it is. You have access to all these images. If you're looking for something specific, you can use this search tab and just look for your desired image. Here I'm going to type computer, for instance. Hit search and you'll find these images. And now you can simply drag and drop one here and it will be inserted to your canvas. You can scale it down, of course, but there is one problem when you use this plugin, and that is you cannot download the highest quality image. So if you want to be able to download the highest quality images, you can simply use the Unsplash website and just using this drop down menu, you can pick this original size or the large size. All right, now I'm going to look for something else. I'm going to look for portrait, a portrait image. Just like this. Let me scroll down. I think this one looks good. I'm going to click on it. The reason I imported this image here is because I'm going to show you another plugin. Let's suppose you want to use this image in your project and you want to get rid of its background. Well, in the past, like a few years ago, when you wanted to do that, you needed to download this image and get rid of the background in Adobe Photoshop or any other design software. However, nowadays, using AI, we no longer need to do that. You can get rid of the background of this image instantly in Figma for free. So let me show you how it's done. I'm going to select this image and I'm going to look for another plugin, which is called Icons 8 Background Remover. And here it is. I'm going to run it. And after a few seconds, look what happens. There we go, the background is gone. Of course it's not perfect, especially when you have hair involved, but it does a pretty decent job. As I said, there are hundreds of different plugins that you can try out depending on your needs, but we are not going to test them out one by one obviously because there are many of them. However, make sure to check out the list attached to this video, and later when we start working on a project, I'm going to show you how you can utilize these plugins when you are actually working on a project. Welcome back! Once you're done designing your user interface, you usually need to export your design files or maybe some parts of it to share them with other designers or with the developer. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can export assets and files from Figma. Let's dive in. Here is our card that we already prepared. To export anything in Figma, first you need to select it. Then you need to head over to the export section in the design panel, right under the effects section, and just click on this plus icon and you will see all these properties. So let's see what these properties are. Here we have the scale factor. By default it's set to 1x, and if I open up this drop down menu, you'll see 1x, 1.5x, 2x, 3x, etc. You can also specify a custom value here. So as I said, this is the scale factor. And when it's set to 1x, basically Figma will export it with its current resolution, with its current DPI or dot per inch, which is a little bit technical. Figma by default export files with a 72 DPI, and if you want to increase that DPI, basically to increase the quality of your files, you can increase this scale factor to, for instance, double that DPI. If you want to get a 144 DPI, you can just set the scale to 2x. At the moment, once you export it, you'll get the exact same dimension, the current dimension of this card, which is 400 roughly. Let me just change it to 400 here. So let's give it a try. I'm gonna export it here. And when I preview the info of this file, as you can see, its dimension is 400 by 523. But sometimes, as I said, you may need to export your files with a higher resolution. For that, you can just set the scale to maybe 2x. And now if I export it, now as you can see, the dimensions are doubled. We usually export files at 2x when we know that those files are going to be rendered on Retina displays that have higher resolutions. Okay, what about the next property? The next property is suffix. What's suffix? Well, whatever you type here will be added to the file name. So here, when you export this card, let me just change it to new card. When you export it, the file name will be new card. But sometimes you may need to add something after this file name in order to keep your files organized. Here you can specify that suffix. Let's say draft. Now if I export it, look what happens. The name file is now new card draft. Let me get rid of this suffix. The next property is the format. By default it's set to PNG. We have different formats like JPEG, SVG, and PDF. Well, PNG stands for Portable Network Graphics. It's basically a file format that allows you to have transparency. So whenever you want to have transparency, just like what we have here we have some transparent background since we have rounded corners, you need to make sure to export your files as PNG, not JPEG, because JPEG, first of all, compresses your images. So keep in mind that if you don't want to lose the quality of your images, you need to always export your files as PNG. But if you don't care about some compression, you can go with JPEG as well, and you'll have some smaller file sizes. And JPEG doesn't support transparency, so that's the main difference between PNG and JPEG. Next we have SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. So when you export elements using SVG, they are going to be editable since they are vector files. Let me show you an example. I'm going to draw a circle here, just like this. Let's make it red. And let's go ahead and export it. I'm going to add an export property to it, and I'm going to export it here. Now I'm going to bring it back to Figma, and I'm going to zoom in. As you can see, as I zoom in, it gets pixelated. Why? Because PNG and JPEG are raster graphic files, which means that they basically create images using pixels. But that's not the case with the SVG format, because the SVG format is a vector format. So it's basically a bunch of code that renders a shape. It could be an icon, it could be a circle, it could be any shape. And when you export your files as SVG and you try to resize that, it won't lose quality. However, if I try to scale this circle up, look what happens. You see, it gets pixelated. Now I'm gonna select this exact same circle and I'm gonna change the type here to JPEG to show you how the transparency works. I'm gonna export it and I'm gonna import it to Figma. As you can see, we no longer get that transparent background, and also it has a lower quality. Now I'm gonna get rid of that and I'm gonna export it as SVG file. If I do that and I import it to Figma and I try to zoom in, it doesn't lose quality because it's not created by pixels. And the other benefit of using SVG files is that they are editable. So once you import them in Figma, you can just go ahead and select it, hit enter, and you'll enter the edit mode and you'll get access to all these nodes and you can modify them just like a path. The SVG format is suitable for icons, sometimes logos, and decorative elements. But for images, you cannot use SVG because images are raster files. And obviously we have the PDF format as well. It's not that useful for UI UX designers, but if you're designing an iOS application, it could be useful to export your files as PDF, since Xcode, which is the official IDE of Apple, supports PDF and the developer can easily organize all the assets within Xcode. But usually we use PNG and SVG. Now imagine you want to export multiple files at once. How can you do that? First, if you want to export many different elements within your file here, you need to go ahead and select them and you need to add an export property to them. Let's suppose we want to export multiple cards. I'm going to just expand this frames dimension like this. I'm going to move it to the left. Let's duplicate it, move it to the right, just like this. And I'm going to change the background color here for the second card to something else, maybe dark gray. And for this one, I'm going to change it to light blue like this. Okay, so we have 3 different cards, and now imagine you want to export them all at once. So what you should do is this. You need to make sure that they all have an export property applied. They can have different scale factors, different formats, it doesn't matter. Let me show you. You can select this one and you can change it to maybe 1x. You can select this one and change it to 3x if you want. You can even change the format. And then once you are done adding this export property to the elements you want to export, you need to head over to this menu right here, the main menu, head over to File, and here you can find this export option. Once you click on it, this modal pops up and it allows you to export these cards all at once. So here you can preview all the elements that have an export property applied, and then you can hit export and it will create a zip file, and inside you'll find all these cards. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about collaboration and commenting in Figma. If you work with a team of designers, chances are you are going to collaborate with them on a project. The best possible way to collaborate with them is to invite them to your project. Of course, you can get a local copy of your project and send it to them. They can import it to their Figma account. However, those projects won't be connected, so you are basically not collaborating and it would be too hard to understand what's going on. Instead, you can simply click on this share button right here, this blue button, and here you will see this invite tab. Here you can basically invite others to your project. You can just enter their email addresses, and here you can specify their access, whether they can only view your project or they can also edit the project. If you're just sharing your project with a viewer, maybe someone that needs to just comment on your project, you need to set the access to can view. But if you set it to can edit, he or she can start editing your project. So keep that in mind. You can also set the access right here By default, it's set to anyone with the link. You can change it to only people invited to this file. And then you can click on copy link, and then you can send it to someone else. You can send it to your developer, you can send it to your friends, to other designers, to your boss, to your client, etc. And then they can open up the exact same project file and they can start commenting on your project. So the way you can comment in Figma is by just choosing this option, this tool in the toolbar. And let's suppose you want to add a comment for this line of text, this one. I'm going to hover over this area, left click to add a comment, and here I'm going to write a comment. Let's type, this title can be a little bit bigger, just like this, and hit send. And then other people that have access to this file can see this comment. They can open it up and they can reply. So basically you can chat here about this particular issue, and once it's resolved, you can just click on this resolve icon and this comment will be gone. And you will see all your comments right here. So let's create another comment. I'm gonna create a comment right here. Check the contrast ratio of this button. Hit send, and we have two different comments. You can also resolve these right here. So this is how you can collaborate with others in Figma. In today's episode, we are going to talk about Figma variables, and by the end of this video, you'll learn how to use variables in Figma like a pro. So what are variables? Variables allow you to save reusable values that can be applied to different design properties like fill, stroke, padding, margin, etc. But wait, isn't it the definition of styles? Well, not really. Although both styles and variables allow you to store reusable values, they have two fundamental differences. A style can be used for properties that are made up of multiple values, such as gradients or shadows. For instance, you can create a color style that has multiple fields. On the other hand, variables can store individual raw values like a hex color code or a string of text. The other difference is that a style can't reference another style, but a variable can reference another variable or even a style. And this is what makes variables so powerful. Why? Because we are now able to create design tokens. If you don't know what they are, don't worry, we are going to talk about them in this video. Alright, now that you know what variables are, let's start creating them. So here, as you can see, I already designed this product card, and it includes a product image, a title, a description, and this add to cart button, and also this price tag. And I designed this card using these colors. Okay, here as you can see, I have a blue color scale, a gray color scale, and also these two base colors. So here, if I select any of these elements, for example this button, as you can see, it's not using any color style or any variable. The same thing applies to these elements, these text layers here. So now let's see how you can create variables in Figma and how you can utilize them properly. First of all, make sure to not select anything. I'm just going to click somewhere here, and on the right side you can find this local variables section. I'm going to click on this icon, and here this window pops up. Here it allows me to create a collection. Basically, we can create different collections of variables. By default, this collection 1 is there. I'm going to go ahead and rename it now. I'm going to rename it to primitives. You can rename it to whatever you want, but I'm going to name it primitives. So now inside this collection, we can start creating our variables. I'm going to hit this create variable button. And as you can see, we can create 4 different types of variables: color, number, string, and boolean. Figma mentioned that they are going to add more variable types in the future, but at the moment we only have access to these 4 types. So here I'm going to click on color to create a color variable. Just like creating a color style, we are going to name it. I'm going to name it blue-50, and now I can assign a value to this variable. Okay, and the value should be a hex color code. So what I'm going to do is link this variable to this particular tint of blue. Now I'm going to click here, and using this eyedropper, I'm going to click on this color just like this. And now we just created our first variable, blue50, with this particular value. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a specific variable for each shade and each tint of this blue. Okay, so what we can do is click on create variable and just click on color to create another color variable, or we can just duplicate this particular variable. To duplicate it, you can hit shift and enter. Sometimes it doesn't work, I'm sure it's a bug, but if you just create another collection here, I'm just going to quickly create another collection and I just switch between these collections. And now if I hit shift and enter, it works perfectly. I'm going to hit shift and enter a few times, just like this, because I'm going to create many different variables. Of course, we don't need all these variables to design this card, but I'm just going to show you the process of creating variables for your projects. So here, I'm going to go ahead and quickly rename these variables. This second one is going to be 100. And I'm going to fast forward this process. All right, perfect. I created all these variables and I renamed them. Now I need to go ahead and just change their values, okay? We just need to select the second one, which is blue 100. And using this eyedropper, I'm going to click on this 100 shade like that. And I'm just going to continue doing that one by one. All right, great. Our variables are ready. Now I'm going to group these variables. How can you group variables? You can simply select this bottom one, hold down the shift key on your keyboard and click on this first one to select all these variables. Then just right click on one of them and just click on new group with selection, just like this. And as you can see, a new group has been created. Now I'm just going to double click on it and just rename it to color/blue. So we basically created a color category and then the blue subcategory underneath, just like this. As you can see, we have this color category and then inside we have this blue category. Perfect. Now I'm just going to click on this all variables and we just need to create different variables for this gray color scale as well. So basically we need to repeat the same process. I'm going to click on create variable, just like this. And I'm going to call it gray 50, hit enter. Just change its value to gray 50. And now you know what to do. We just need to duplicate this variable multiple times, rename them, and just change their values. So I'm going to hit shift and enter, just like this, a few times. Okay, perfect. Now let me quickly rename them. Great. Now let's change their values. I'm going to go ahead and change their values one by one, and I'm going to fast forward this process. All right, it's done. Now we need to create another group, so I'm just going to hold down the shift key on my keyboard and just select these gray variables. Right click on one of them, click on new group with selection, and here I'm going to type color/gray, just like this. And now as you can see, we have two subcategories under this color category. But we are not done yet. We need to create two base colors as well. So let's select this all variables, and I'm just going to create another color variable. And this one is going to be white and the value should be intact. Now I'm going to create another variable and I'm going to call it black and I'm going to change it to this color, just like this. Now let's select them both, put them inside a group, and I'm going to rename this to color/base. Just like this. So we just created our color variables. We created the blue variables, the gray variables, and the base variables. Now let's go ahead and create another type of variable, a number variable. So I'm going to click on all variables, and here let's click on create variable, and I'm just going to click on number, and now I'm going to create my spacing variables. So here for the first one, I'm going to call it 0, and the value is going to be 0. Now I'm going to duplicate it, hit shift and enter, and let's duplicate it a few more times. Like that. For the second one, I'm going to name it 1. I'm going to name this one 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. I'm not going to go ahead and create variables for all the numbers we need for a project, but you got the idea, right? So for this variable, I'm going to change the value to 4, assuming that we are using a 4-point grid system. For the second one, I'm going to set it to 8. For the third one, I'm going to set it to 12. The next one is going to be 16. The next one is going to be 20. And the next one is going to be 24. Now let's select these number variables and just group them just like this. And this time I'm going to call it spacing. Okay, perfect. So we created our color variables and our spacing variables. And now you might say that, all right, now it's time to apply them to our design, right? Not really, because basically when we create these variables under this primitives collection, we are not going to use them directly. So we are not going to select this button, for instance, and just try to apply one of our variables to this button. Why? Because if we do that, it's just like using a color style. So what's the difference between variables and color styles? There should be a reason for using variables, right? And you're going to find out what the reason is. So here I'm going to click on local variables. And what we need to do now is create another collection. So now we are going to create another collection. I already did that. I'm going to rename this to tokens. So now we basically need to tokenize our variables. But what's a token? A design token is a simple reusable design decision that represents a design attribute or style such as colors, spacing, text, etc. So let me show you how to create your design tokens now. Under this collection, we are going to create another variable, again a color variable, but this time we are going to name it differently, okay? So here I'm going to type surface primary. So this is going to be the color that we are going to use for the primary surface. In this case, it's going to be the background of this card, okay? And now you might say that, all right, we need to set the value to white. So we need to leave it as is, but that's not true. Remember when I mentioned variables can reference another variable? Well, let me show you how it works. So here, instead of using a hard-coded value like this hex color code, we are going to make this variable reference another variable, one of the variables that we already created. To do that, you can just click here and go to libraries. And here, as you can see, we have all the variables we already created. We have primitives, color blue, color gray, and base colors. Okay, for the surface primary, I know that it should be white, so I can just link it to this color base white, just like this. And now this variable, this surface primary variable, is tied to this variable that we already created, and it's called an alias. When a variable references another variable, we call it an alias. Here, if I go ahead and detach it, I'm going to show you another way of creating an alias. You can just right click here and just click on create alias, just like this, and then you can just click on white here. All right, cool. So now let's go ahead and create another variable here. I'm going to create another color variable, and this time I'm going to name it button background primary. So for the button background primary variable, I'm going to change the value to this particular shade of blue. Okay, it's going to be blue 600. So what I'm going to do is just link it to blue 600. Just like that. And now it's referencing this particular variable that we already created. Now let's create another color variable. I'm going to name it button label primary. Our button label should be white. So again, I'm going to assign it to color base white. So let's go to libraries, and from here, I'm going to assign it to color base white. And now, as you can see, we have two variables that are referencing the same variable. And that's why design tokens are so powerful. You cannot do that using color styles. Okay, now let's go ahead and create another color variable. I'm going to call it text primary, and I'm going to set its value to gray 950. This one, the darkest shade of gray that we have here. And now we need one more color variable, and it's going to be named text secondary. And the color is going to be gray 500. I'm going to assign it to gray 500, just like this. And now we just created all the design tokens we need for this card. Of course, for a complete project, you may need to create many variables here. But for this card, we don't need more than that. Okay, now let's go ahead and select them all. And I'm going to create a group. And I'm going to rename it to color. Perfect. What else do we need? Before we go ahead and apply these design tokens to our card, we need to create our spacing system as well. So here, I'm going to click on all variables. I'm going to click on create variable, and this time we need a number variable. And here I'm going to name it spacing none. And as for the value, I'm going to click on this little icon, and from the library, I'm going to set it to 0. This is one of the variables that we already created. Next, let's go ahead and create another variable. This time it's going to be spacing XXS, and I'm going to change its value to 1. I'm going to create another variable. This one is going to be spacing XS, and let's change its value to another variable, which is going to be this one, number 2. I'm going to create a few more variables here. This one is going to be spacing small, like that. let's assign it to spacing 3. Let's create a few more. This one is going to be spacing medium, and it's going to be assigned to spacing 4. The next one is going to be spacing large, and it's going to be assigned to spacing 5. Of course, you don't need to use these values linearly. You can just skip one value. For example, you can assign this spacing large to this particular variable. But for this project, I'm just going to keep it as is. I'm going to create one more variable, and I'm going to name it spacing x large, like that. And let's assign it to number 6. Now let's select them all, group them, and just call it spacing system. And now our design tokens are ready. Now we can go ahead and apply these design tokens to this card. Let's see how it works. Here, I'm going to select this card frame. As you can see, it's an auto layout frame. And I'm going to go ahead and link all its properties like fill, corner radius, etc. to our design tokens. So here, while this card is selected, I'm going to head over to the field section, and I'm going to click on this little icon, and from here you can find all the variables you created, but make sure not to use your primitives, okay? You need to use your design tokens. So here under tokens, I'm going to click on surface primary, and now the background color of this card is tied to this particular design token, color surface primary. Now let's go ahead and select this text, and I'm just going to repeat the same thing. This time I'm going to link it to text primary. For this one as well, I'm going to link it to text primary. Here I created two different text layers. As you can see, we have the location and we have this available in label. I'm going to show you why in a few minutes, because I'm going to show you another feature of variables, okay? But for now, I'm just going to select it, and I'm just going to link it to text secondary. This one should be linked to text primary, like this. The price tag also should be linked to text primary. We already did that. Now let's select our button, and we just need to link its field to button background primary. And also we need to select its label and just link it to button label primary. But we are not done yet, because we just linked our colors to our design tokens, but we didn't use any of our spacing tokens. So let's go ahead and use them now. Here for the corner radius, I'm not going to use any tokens at the moment, because we are going to create another set of tokens for the corner radius value. But what we can do is select this card, and if we head over to the auto layout panel here, we can click on this little icon, and from here I'm going to head over to tokens, and here you can find all the spacing tokens. So as for the padding, I'm going to set it to spacing medium, and this one should be set to spacing medium. Now I'm going to select this content frame inside, and we just need to open up this drop down menu and just click on apply variable, and from here I'm going to choose number 3, this one. Then I'm going to select this button, and let's apply variables here as well. I'm going to select number 6, and for this one should be number 3. And then we can select our content, and inside, as you can see, we have another auto layout frame. Here we can apply our variable as well, this one. And inside this content frame, we have another frame. We have two other frames. I'm going to select this one. This one is set to auto, and this one is set to 4. So we just need to apply our variable here to 4. Perfect. But what about the corner radius values? So let's go ahead and quickly create a few radius tokens as well. Here I'm going to click on spacing system, because we are going to create these variables under the spacing system category. And let's call it radius small. And the value could be 8. So I'm going to assign it to number 2. And I'm going to create another variable like this. Let's call it radius medium. And this one is going to be 12 pixels. So I'm going to set it to number 3. And let's create one more, radius large. And I'm going to assign it to number 4, which is 16 pixels. All right, great. So now we can select our card. And here, as you can see, the corner radius is set to 12. I'm going to click on this little icon, and under the design tokens here, I'm going to set it to radius medium like this. Next, I'm going to select this image and just set it to radius small. And also I'm going to select my button and just change it to radius small. All right, great. So we linked all these properties, the field property, the auto layout padding property, and also the corner radius property to our design tokens. Now let me show you why we went through this boring process, okay? So imagine you want to change the color of this button. What you can do now is head over to your design tokens, and here the only thing you need to change is the value of this particular variable, button background primary. Okay, let's suppose you want to use a darker shade. What you can do is click on it and just change it to blue 700. But you might say, Arash, we could do the exact same thing using color styles. Yes, you could do that, but there is a huge difference between tokens and color styles, basically between variables and color styles. So here, as you can see, we can give these variables semantic names, and you can quickly understand what this variable is all about. But that's not the case with color styles. So let's suppose you want to change the background color here. If you used color styles, you had two different choices. Number one, you could just go ahead and change your color style. However, that way, this button label would be affected as well. And that's not what you want because you just want to change your background color. Number two is you need to go ahead and select this card and just change its style here. And imagine you want to make changes to multiple different elements. You need to go ahead and modify them one by one. But when you use design tokens, you can easily change the value of your design tokens. For instance, if you want to change this label color, you can simply head over to this button label primary and just change it to something else. You can change it to black, for instance, if you want. Okay? I'm going to set it back to white. But let's suppose you want to change your entire color palette. In that case, you can head over to your primitives and just change all these colors. So let's say you are not satisfied with this shade of blue here, okay? And you want to darken it, for instance. If you just head over to primitives and from here you adjust this particular variable, you can just click right here and just modify it easily. But what about the spacing system? Let's suppose for some reason you decided that your corner radius values should be increased. So here, let's say your smallest corner radius value should be 12 instead of 8. So what you can do is just change this value to number 3. So now it's referencing this particular variable, which is 12 pixels, and the next one should be number 4. And as soon as I change that, as you can see, the corner radius value here has been increased. All right, that's how you can create variables and design tokens. Before we move on to the next topic, I'm going to show you something very important here, okay? And that's the scope of your variables. So here, if I head over to spacing system, as you can see, we created these 3 radius variables. And we know that these 3 variables should be reserved for the corner radius value. However, it doesn't work like that at the moment. If I just go ahead and select this frame here, and I just click on this little icon, under the spacing system, as you can see, I can set this value to radius small as well. But that's not what I want. It shouldn't be available for these values. It should be reserved for the corner radius value. Okay, so how can we make that happen? Well, it's quite simple. I'm going to head over to the tokens collection, and from here, I'm going to select this variable. And as you can see, this icon appears here. It says edit variable. If I just click on it, this window pops up, and here we have a section called number scoping. It basically shows you all the properties that could be linked to this variable, this particular variable. And as you can see now, it says corner radius, width and height, gap, and text content. That's not what we want. We just need to uncheck these checkboxes. This one, but this one should be checked. We need to repeat the same thing for this variable. I'm going to make sure that this one is checked and uncheck the others, and this one as well. I'm going to check this one. And now if I select this frame and if I try to head over to my library, as you can see now, those values are gone. The same thing applies to color variables. So here, if I just select any of these color variables, like this one, you can see that you can apply it to frame, to shape, to text, to stroke. If you want to reserve it for the field property, you can just uncheck this checkbox, for instance. All right, now that you learned how to create variables, how to tokenize your variables, it's time to take your design to the next level. I'm going to show you how you can create different modes for your variable collections. This feature is only available to paid users, so if you don't have a paid account, you cannot use that, unfortunately, but it's good to learn that in case in the future future you want to use a paid account, you know how to create different modes. So let's say we want to create a light mode and a dark mode for this card. How can we do that? It's quite simple. Here I'm going to head over to the tokens collection. We can do it in the primitives as well, depending on our needs, but I'm going to do it here in this tokens collection. As you can see here, we have this plus icon. If I click on it, now it says mode 1 and mode 2. Basically, Figma selects this first column as the default mode of this particular collection, but you can always change that. I'm going to rename it to light, and this one should be dark. Okay, so what we need to do now is change the values of this second column. Okay, so for the dark version, I'm going to change this value, surface primary, to black. Okay, so the background of this card should be changed to black. Then as for the button background primary, I'm going to change this color. We usually make it lighter on dark mode. So I'm going to change it to 300. And by the way, we need to change it back to 600. As for the label, I'm going to change it to black, like that. The text primary color should be gray 50, something light because our background is dark. So I'm going to change it to gray 50. And the text secondary is going to be gray 500. So I'm not going to change that. Okay, so now let's see how this works. Here, if I select this card frame, since we created another mode, if I head over to the layer section here, this icon appears. Okay, I can just open it up. And here under tokens, as you can see, it's set to auto. Okay, so the mode is automatically set to light, which is the first column of our collection, our variable collection. I can change it to dark. And there we go, here is our dark mode. Let me go ahead and create another frame next to it, just like this. And I'm going to place it inside so you can easily see the difference. And I'm going to change the background of this frame 1 to something else. I'm going to use one of my primitives here, maybe gray 50 or gray 100, this one. And now if I select this card, I can easily change its mode. I'm going to change it back to light. And you can just change it back to dark. It's quite cool, isn't it? But I'm going to show you one more thing here. I'm going to set it back to auto. And here, if I select this frame 1, which is the parent of this card, I can change the mode of its parent, and the mode of this card will be changed as well. So I'm going to select this frame 1, and from here, I'm going to change it to dark. And now, as you can see, the mode of this frame 1 has been changed, but the elements inside are also affected. Now let me show you something else. Okay, so here I'm going to name this frame dark. I'm going to duplicate it, hit Ctrl D or Command D. Let's put it here. I'm just going to rename it to light, and now I can just change it to light. Okay, if I just get rid of this card, I can simply select this card, and if I bring it over here, look what happens. You see that? It automatically changes its mode. Why? Because we changed its parent mode, which is this main frame. And if I select this card, its mode is set to auto. All right, great. Now let's take it to the next level. I'm going to show you how you can localize your elements. Okay, so basically what we need to do is create another collection here. I'm going to go ahead and create another collection, and I'm just going to rename it to text. And here I'm going to create a string variable. I'm going to name it product name, and the value is going to be lemon. So I'm just going to change it here to lemon. What else should be translated? This label available in, I'm just going to copy it. And here I'm going to create another string variable. I'm going to paste it here, available in. For this first column, I'm going to set it to available in. So we just need to use the exact same values. The location shouldn't be translated. I'm just going to create another string variable. Let's call it price. And the value is going to be 2.99. And we need one more variable for this button label. I'm just going to copy it and just create another string variable, paste it here and here. Okay, so let me show you what's going on here. Basically, I'm going to create two different modes for this collection, the English version and the German version. Basically, the English mode and the German mode. So I'm going to hit this plus button, and now we have two different modes. I'm going to rename this first one to English, like this, and the second one to German. Now what we need to do is translate these values to German. I already did that, so I'm just going to copy and paste the values quickly. There it is. I hope they are correct. And now let's go ahead and link these text layers to our variables. Okay, so I'm going to select the product name. I'm going to head over to the text section, and from here I'm going to click on this icon, and under the text category I'm going to choose product name. Then I'm going to select this price tag. Again, I'm going to link it to price. Then let's select this label. That's why I created two different text layers, because I wanted to show you this feature as well. And I'm going to link it to available in. And finally, I'm going to select this button label and just link it to add to cart, just like that. Now let's see how it works. Here, I'm going to select the main frame, the parent frame. And if I head over to the layer section and I click on this icon, now here we have another collection, the text collection. And by default, it's set to auto. And here we have English and German. I'm going to click on German now, and there it is, as simple as that. Here is our German version. You want to change it to dark mode? You can do that easily. You can simply change it to dark, and your card is ready. Before we wrap up this video, I'm going to show you one more thing. If you're working on a project and you already created hundreds of different color styles, and you just don't want to go ahead and manually create all these primitive variables, I have good news for you. There is a plugin that you can use. If you just look for styles to variable, there it is, this one. You can just run this plugin and it will automatically create variables for you based on your color styles. So it converts all your color styles to variables in seconds. And that's amazing, isn't it? The other thing I'd like to point out here is that you can link a color style to a variable. How? Let me show you how. I'm going to quickly create a color style. I'm just going to select this one, for instance. And from here, I'm going to create a color style. I'm going to name it base black, and I'm going to hit create style. So as you can see here, I have this black color style. Now, if I just click on this icon, from here, I can head over to libraries, and I can just link this color style to one of the variables we created. Okay, and it's gonna be color base black, just like that. So you can still keep using color styles if you want, and you can just link your color styles to variables. Welcome back. In this video, we're gonna talk about dev mode. What's dev mode? Well, basically, dev mode is a dedicated space for developers to inspect your design. In the past, we had another tab right next to this prototype tab called inspect, but it's no longer available because now we have a dedicated space for developers. So how can you enter this particular space? It's so simple. Here, as you can see right next to this share button, we have this large switch. As you can see, if I hover over it, it says dev mode. And if I just click on it, as you can see, all these buttons turned green, which indicates that we are in the dev mode. When you're in the dev mode, you cannot modify your design, and it's actually a good thing because you don't want the developer to accidentally move things around, okay? So let's see how it works. If I just left click somewhere in the canvas, on the right side, you'll see this inspect panel, and here we have code settings. You can specify the language and the unit. So here, as you can see, by default for me it's set to CSS. You can change it to iOS if you're working on an iOS app, or Android if you're working on an Android app, but for now I'm going to leave it as is. And then we have the unit. By default it's set to pixel. You can change it to rem as well. If you don't know what rem is, that's fine. It basically stands for root M, and rem units dictate an element's font size relative to the size of the root element. And by default, most browsers use the font size value of 16 pixels. So if we set our base font size to 16, 1 rem would be 16 pixels, 2 rem would be 32 pixels, etc. Usually developers don't use pixel values, okay? Instead, they use relative values like rem to make everything responsive and to make an adaptive layout. That's the simplest definition of rem. So when you hand over your project to the developer, he or she can head over to this particular setting and they can easily change the unit to rem. and then they can start inspecting your design. Let me change it back to pixel for now. And here, if I select this card, let's see what we get here. As you can see here, we have all the measurements. We have the padding, you can see the margins as well. Here, as you can see, if I just select this frame, let me zoom in. If I just hover over this particular place, as you can see here, we'll get the margin between these tags. And this way, the developer can easily inspect your design and turn your design to code. So here, let me select this profile image, this avatar frame. And on the right side, you can also inspect this particular frame. Here, as you can see, we have the corner radius of 80. We have the padding, we have the margin, and here we have the CSS code. So the developer can easily copy and paste this code and make some adjustments, obviously, because sometimes not all of these codes are useful for a developer, but they can make the developer's life much easier. And also the developer can inspect all the color styles. They can also export assets right here. It's not recommended. I personally prefer to prepare all the assets by myself for a variety of reasons that we will talk about later. Now let's go ahead and change the unit. I'm gonna click somewhere here and I'm gonna change the unit to rem. Now if I select this card, look what we get. Here, the values changed. Now we have 0.75. Why? Because if you remember, here we had a 12 pixel padding, right? And as I mentioned before, the base unit for a rem value is 16 pixels. So if you just divide 12 by 16, you will get 0.75. So this is a rem value that the developer can use in the code. Here, if you take a look at this code snippet, as you can see here, we have the padding 0.75 rem, and all these values, the width, the height, everything has been changed to rem. And here we have 1 rem, which means that the spacing between these two frames is 16 pixels. And that's basically how the developer can change the units and just inspect your design. The other tab we have here is the plugins tab. Here you can use dedicated plugins to modify your code snippet if you want to, or the developer may need to do that, and it's quite helpful. We are not going to go through this because it's going to be a little bit more complicated since it's related to the development part, but keep in mind that this tab exists. Now let's talk about the other things that actually matter to you, and you need to be aware of them. Imagine you designed this card and it's ready for the development. What you can do is this. You can simply head over to the design mode, and here you can create a section. You can just use this section tool and just draw a section right here to put your card inside this section. As you can see here, we have this section 1 and our card is inside this section 1. Let me call it card. So here we have this card section and this card is ready to be implemented. What we can do is click on this icon, and when we do that, it will be marked as ready for development. As soon as I do that, as you can see, it says ready for development. And now if we head over to the dev mode here, and here on the left side, we can see a list of pages or a list of frames that are ready for implementation. And that's awesome. So the developer can easily understand which elements or which components should be developed first. Now let's talk about another cool feature of dev mode. Here, if I select this card on the left side, on the right side, as you can see, we have this button, compare changes. If I just click on it, this window pops up, and here we can compare the changes we made to this particular card. The other thing the developer can do is use the VS Code extension, the Figma's VS Code extension. So here, if I select this card section and I click on this little icon, as you can see, it says open in VS Code. I don't have the VS Code installed on my computer, but if you do, or if your developer has the VS Code installed on his or her computer, they can simply get all these code snippets that we see here right inside VS Code, and they can accelerate the development process. Alright, that's all for the dev mode for now. We are not gonna get into some technical details of dev mode since it's not related to the design process, but I just wanted you to be aware of all the possibilities that come with Figma's dev mode.